and then I'm just going to kind of let patterns emerge from the data. I simultaneously collected data and analyzed data, and this was actually really useful because in my early interviews, I come up, a preconceived set of questions, and as I'm collecting the data and as I'm analyzing, I'm starting to see patterns emerge. And what that allows me to do is say, hey, let's say at interview number 5, there's something really interesting that just jumps out. Something I didn't even think about asking, let's say, participant number 1 or 2. Well, with grounded theory, I can go back in, re-interview those first participants and say, hey, was any of this happening? And, it just allows more patterns to emerge, and it strengthens the analysis. Grounded theory aims to construct middle range theories, right? So I'm not looking for this grand narrative here. I did develop a model of deconversion, but in no way am I saying that this model is generalizable to every single apostate, right? It was just generalizable to, the sample that I had. It enables the study of processes. Well, as I was saying, deconversion is comprised of several different processes, right? So this is just perfect to study that. Lastly, it supports researchers in developing an original theoretical analysis. I think I've done that, but I'm going to let you guys decide. So who was I talking to? I had 2 criteria for exclusion in the study. One was age and one was denomination. All right, and so I was looking at ages 18 to 46. Now, the reason I use that age range, you might think that's an odd age range, 18 to 46. But that age range comprises people who are considered Gen X, as well as millennials. So in the sociological data, in the literature, there's a lot of information on baby boomers and that generation. But there's little information on post-boomer generations. And when you situate it in kind of a cultural context of the spiritual marketplace, you'll find that the experiences of post-boomer generations are quite different than the previous generation. I also just narrowed it to evangelical. What a lot of people don't know is that the term evangelical it's an umbrella term, and it's comprised of about 50 different denominations. So a lot of people, I would interview, they weren't sure if they were evangelical. I'm Baptist, I don't know if that's evangelical. It is. It is. My total sample size was 20. So I had 10 atheists, and then I had 4 agnostic and 6 spiritual not religious. Now these 3 categories make up what's known as spiritual nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Fun play on words. The experiences of the atheists, all very similar. But then the agnostic and spiritual not religious categories were very different than the atheist category. But those 2 were similar enough where I was able to kind of collapse those 2 groups just into one group. I'm calling them the spiritually uncertain. It's a work in progress. And like I said, today we're just going to be talking about the atheist experience. In terms of demographics, I had 13 men, 7 women, and the mean age was 30. This is a table you can see of all the different participants, and male, female, and all of the participants' names have been changed for privacy, so what you're going to see today is all pseudonyms. And there were about 5 different evangelical denominations represented in the study. Okay, now we're going to get to the good stuff. In terms of the findings, I want to introduce 2 major concepts before I show you the model of deconversion. The first concept I'm going to introduce is what I'm calling a typology of experience, which is kind of the intersection of cognitive, social, and emotional experiences. So the cognitive experiences, right, this is comprised of logical inconsistencies, which eventually allowed my participants to reject various parts of dogma. In terms of the social experiences, we're dealing more with behavioral inconsistencies, so things like hypocrisy or judgment that you would see in the religious communities, but you don't necessarily expect to see these things when you go to church. And then the emotional experiences, these were shaped by the cognitive and social experiences. And so, they would hear things like, let's say, all homosexuals are bad and they're not moral. But then they would, meet somebody who identified as gay, and they were like, wait, they're a good person. This doesn't make sense. And there was like internal conflict, which really shaped kind of how they experienced things emotionally. I'm just going to say it, right, because we have a really great narrative that really discusses this. The other major concept I want to introduce is called paradigmatic work. Now, this is like the work processes that I was talking about that allow people to dismantle their religious identities and formulate a wholly new type of identity. So these work processes are consistent with the typology of experience, right? And so we have cognitive work, which is really comprised of this epistemological restructuring, dissonance reduction, and then biographical restructuring. So they had to kind of change their biography to who they were as a religious person, to who they were going to be as an irreligious person. The social work is really just about severing those incompatible religious ties with most of their religious friends, not all. You know, some people retained religious people in their lives. And then finding more congruent social associations. You know, people like the Secular Alliance or the Las Vegas Atheists. You know, finding people that kind of validated, you know, who they were as an apostate. And lastly, emotional work, which was this deliberate shift in one's emotional disposition. So going from being, let's say, depressed about their religious participation and what they were experiencing in those communities, and to saying, hey, I'm going to be happy. You know, being an atheist actually makes me happy. And that's something that came over through the narratives, which, you know, if you think back to that 1993 study where apostates were, you know, reporting lower rates of happiness, to now say, no, and being an atheist makes me happy. That's a significant shift. So we have the deconversion processes model. You guys kind of see that? I know it's a little bit small. I'll try and go through it for you and not shut off my PowerPoint here. So these people start with like some sort of legitimated sacred canopy, right? So some sort of religious foundation. You know, and the strength of one's religious identity, you know, that varied across the participants, but there was some sort of religious identity there. Okay? Then they started experiencing anomalies and crises. So this is where the typology of experience comes in. They started experiencing logical inconsistencies, behavioral inconsistencies, and cognitive dissonance. Now, like I said, the two categories, the experiences were different. So just in terms of the atheists, the most important things that emerged in this typology of experience were the logical inconsistencies. Things like, wait, the world is, I'm being told the world is 10,000 years old, but in science class it's like 4.6 billion, this doesn't make sense. You know, and trying to resolve that. And then the cognitive dissonance. Now, they did still experience behavioral inconsistencies, but that was mostly kind of in the background. In order to kind of mitigate what's going on here in the typology experience, they would engage in information seeking. Well, this information seeking began to delegitimate the sacred canopy. So things started to really break down here. Okay. The moment of deconversion for most, not all, but most of the participants that identified as atheists was instantaneous. So what's happening up in the front here, all of this, gradual processes. But that moment, that actual decision to deconvert, to say, I am no longer an evangelical Christian, for most was pretty instantaneous. But it came with problems. Right after the moment of deconversion, there was the emergence of new crises. So people didn't understand, like, what does it mean to be an atheist? Like, what does this mean for my life? What does this mean for my interactions? Like, who am I now? In order to kind of mitigate these new crises, okay, they went into the paradigmatic work. So different cognitive work, social work, and emotional work. Eventually, what ended up happening for the atheist participants was the development and legitimation of what I'm calling a pragmatic canopy. And we'll talk about